like to acknowledge the Indigenous land we're on and the elders before we start. It's sort of great that I think we are, after so many years, finally recognising that there's an Aboriginal history to this place as well. But back in the 60s, the Aboriginal history was just sort of starting to get recognised. It was sort of bubbling away underneath the surface, not really being recognised. And I'll sort of come to that a bit too. And I was interested when you said, Tony, about a younger generation being interested in the 60s. I chose the 60s because I thought it was a period that hadn't really been addressed as well as it should be. And as you said, it was a period when everything changed. And so today we're sort of basically going from that very famous exhibition in 1961 in London, Arthur Boyd, to 1968, to the field. So that's just 7 years. So there's this, to get from there to there, Australian art went through not so much many changes, but so many different ways of making art. So that I've just picked out works from the 60s. And that's why I've called it Discrepant Times. Now, so the late 60s, art historians used to call it the late modernism. And modernism, art historians have had a bit of trouble with modernism because it also has a lot of styles. So how do we think about period style, which is what art historians do? They tried to think about what the dominant style of a particular historical period is. And in modernism, it's difficult to do. But in the 60s, I would think the 60s sort of replayed the whole of modernism, all in a decade, and did a bit more as well. So it's very difficult to think of the 60s. What is the sort of underlying narrative that holds all this together, that says this is the 60s? Because we talk about the 60s as if it is a period that's distinct from the 70s and from what went before. Now, I've got a picture here I can look at. So Bernard Smith wrote the first history of the 1960s in this book, his second edition of Australian painting, published at the end of the 60s. He had his first edition published at the end of the 50s, and so he updated it to do the 60s. And I've got that little graph there, which is a graph that follows both his text and his illustrations, the sort of number that occur across the 200 years he's writing about. And you'll notice that when it gets to the 60s, the graph just goes off the map. Because Bernard, because he was so close to it, he couldn't see the 60s. So there's three times as many pages he spends on the 60s than on the 50s. Because of all these different things happening, he feels he's got to talk about all of them. I should say too, there's a theme that runs through this, which is we go from the hot to the cool. We all know the 60s is the decade of the cool. And I sort of want you to think about, why is that hot? Why is that cool? And this idea of hot and cool, if you were around in the 60s, you'll know that it's a central idea of Marshall McLuhan's. And basically, things are hot if they have a lot of information or a lot of data in them, so they're hot. And if they don't have much information, they're cool. So if they don't have much information, we have to do a lot more work as the audience to try and figure out what's going on. Whereas if they're hot, we don't have to think about it much. We can be sort of passive consumers. So hot to cool, does that make sense? Right. Oh, I can't touch it. Yeah. Sorry, I'm still living in the 60s before we had all this stuff. So that straight away is a narrative, right? An underlying narrative. Now, when I said I'd talk on the 60s, I didn't have a particular narrative in mind. I just knew, that's why I called it the discrepant decade, because I didn't know what I would really talk about. So this was my lecture plan here. This is what I'm going to do. Find a narrative. I've just sort of given one. And chapter 1 will be more on that first painting by Boyd, which I've called The Hot Summer of a New National Art, looking mainly at the beginning of the 60s and how the 60s sort of came into being out of the 50s, shall we say. And it'll be in 2 parts, and this is one of my narratives, which I'll get to in a minute, the impact of Jackson Pollock on Australian art, which I'd never really thought about before until I sort of started digging a bit deeper. And then I'm going to talk about 4 what I've called watershed exhibitions that all occurred within about 3 years of each other in that early 60s. And then because there's a lot more in that, I spent a lot more time here. This is a fairly short bit, the cool current of US cultural imperialism, because it basically just comes in and very quickly sort of wipes all that away. It's a short story. So this is how I started. I thought I'd read several books just about the 60s, art in the 60s. And so that's hot, right? Lots of information. It's like Bernard's essay, too much information. It's very hard to see what that's about. But anyway, I found three things, or 3 narratives, I'm calling them, that I found that they had in common. One was that they go from the early, I've put these books, you can see, from early to recent. And they go from a very Euro-American history. So in these 2 books, you'll find no Australian artists mentioned whatsoever. So a bit sort of useless for my lecture, but nevertheless, it gives me a sense of how people thought about the 60s. Australia was not there. One Australian artist in this book, his name is Ian Byrne. Ian Byrne does not appear in Bernard Smith's book at all. Right? So in the 60s, he was a fairly unknown artist in Australia. But in this book, written in 2001, he gets in, and in this one, 2016, which is an exhibition catalogue, a large exhibition, which is probably about the first exhibition. It tries really hard to give a global art history of this period, 1945 to 65. And there's one Australian artist in each decade. One from the 40s, one from the 50s, one from the 60s. Interestingly, it's an Aboriginal artist gets in to represent Australia from the 60s. That's what I meant. It's sort of bubbling away in the 60s, but not really there. That's the Ian Byrne artwork. It's 2 sheets of glass leaning on the wall and little text about it. Conceptual art, in other words. 1967. The second feature I noticed is that they all talked about the 60s being part of something that happened after the Second World War, as if the shadow of the Second World War was still being felt in the 60s. And in fact, in these 2 books, the 1960s just disappears within the idea of 1945. You know, it's as if there's only one period since 1945, which for this is 45 to 65, halfway through the 60s. For Rorimer's book, which is really about conceptual art, she has conceptual art going from 65 into the 70s, and the 60s is not sort of there. What occurs for her before 65 is abstract expressionism, which we think of as 40s and 50s. She says it goes through to 65, and so the 60s gets left out. Thomas Crowe is is just about the 60s. But anyway, even at Thomas Crow, they begin by talking about the war, the end of the war, Hiroshima and things like that, the shadow of that running over it. The third, which surprised me, was every single one of them has, near the beginning, a photo, either this photo like that, or a painting, both from 1950. Jackson Pollock, of course, dies in 1956. He's not alive in the 60s, but his shadow is all over the 60s. A little quote from Katie Siegel, who was a co-author here. The atomic bomb and the American victory was an irrevocable wiping of the historical slate. With Pollock's strip paintings matching for her the extremism of the war. Somehow, when these critics talk about Pollock, they talk about Hiroshima and things like this, when the painting contains that experience. But she argues that we should begin in 1945 because it's not just a new art movement; it's a whole new world that the art is coming out of. I tend to, in my lectures, I load up too much information. It was more because for students to take it away after the lecture and they could check the pictures and a few quotes for them. Now, so the idea of what Pollock is doing became fairly important for me, but those other two narratives I also sort of weave in there. So Jackson Pollock, is he hot or cool? He is. It's something that the historians are. Some say hot, some say cool. Willem de Kooning is definitely hot. There's lots of information in there. It looks like there's lots of information in there, but the more you look at it, it's the same information everywhere. There's a sort of singularity to that, you know, the singularity of the atom bomb, if you like, or something like that. And so I've called it the cool ghost of Pollock in 1960s art. So we have Ian Byrne, obviously, replicating Ian Byrne's painting, replicating or referencing Pollock. More interesting here, Ian Byrne is living in New York now, working in a framing shop. The framing shop gets a big Pollock to stretch and frame. He snips off a bit of canvas from it as a memento, because it's a bit like having a bone of the saint for Ian Byrne. You know, Pollock is this thing, and if I hold that, and then he puts it in a painting. A couple of years later, a thread from a canvas of Jackson Pollock for Australia only. His point being, I think, is that Jackson Pollock is important to Australian artists. And I don't think anyone's written on the influence of Pollock on Australian art. We think of him as an American artist, influencing perhaps European artists. Or Robert Morris, this work here, saying of the abstract expressionists, only Pollock was able to recover, process and hold on to it as part of the end of the form of the work. It's as if all that is about the process, and there's nothing else there but that. And it's sort of that singularity that for Morris and quite a few artists, the work as the artwork is as an object in itself, rather than carrying any other sort of literary meaning or philosophical meaning. So, chapter 1, the first bit, following the thread of Pollock's ghost. So, about half of these artists were in the late 40s and early 50s in New York, Australian artists, some of them studying with some of the abstract expressionists, all of them meeting around. So there's Pollock. Robert Klippel is actually in Paris hanging out with an American abstract expressionist. Margaret Salento's studying under Barnett Newman, another abstract expressionist. Yvonne Audette is over there by, I think, about 52, 53. And Inga King is there in the 6 months in the 1950s. Clement Meadmore goes to New York. So each of these artists, these Australian artists, bring back this information. Pollock's a very unknown artist in 1950, except in these little New York scene. So in a place like Australia, you know, they somehow saw these Pollocks and they brought back this stuff. And in Sydney, all of these artists, except for Inga and Graham King, they're working in Melbourne, are in Sydney. Sydney becomes a bit of a hotspot of Australian abstract expressionism in the 50s. But I think the most... So obviously it's got into Australian art, this germ. But to me the most interesting thing is Bernard Smith's relationship to Jackson Pollock. Now, interestingly, if you look at a Pollock painting and a Bernard Smith painting from 1940, you realise they're of similar spirits. They're both working in a sort of expressionist, surrealist manner, this sort of anxious modernism, you know, the war started and things like this. They're of a sort of similar temperament. Bernard discovers Pollock. We all know what that word discover means. He discovers Pollock in 1949 through Alan Davey, who he befriends. Alan Davey is generally regarded as the first European to discover Pollock. And in 1949, he discovers Pollock at the Venice Biennale in 48 and starts painting like that. And as Bernard said, he's raving about Pollock. Then Bernard goes to the Venice Biennale in 1950 and sees Pollock and says that. He had this sort of visceral reaction to Pollock. He didn't just dislike it. He couldn't stand it. I reacted most strongly with an intense dislike. He was forcing painting to a pitch of abstraction, beyond which it could only destroy its own traditions. He saw it as a sort of the end of art, a stylistic cul-de-sac, a point of no return. And so Pollock haunts Bernard. Bernard writes the first history of Australian art, and this haunting runs through the things. And we'll see in a minute when we look at the exhibition that Bernard Smith did. It's an exhibition. His target is Pollock, you know, to kill Pollock, basically, to put Pollock down. Interestingly, on his way after the Venice Biennale, he's over in England studying, and he's just about to go back to Australia, and he goes to the Lascaux Caves, the Ice Age paintings, which had just been discovered and which avant-garde artists were really excited about, and they were sort of trying to channel the sort of what they saw as the primordial spirit of the caves. He visits it. Here he is in his study in London reading the book on the Lascaux Caves, and he said it was just such a profound feeling for him. He said he can never forget the Lascaux Caves, but nor could he forget Pollock. These two things, and they were like two opposites that were the same in many ways. So the big thing that happens at the end of the 50s is, and there's a book with that title, New York Steals the Idea of Modern Art from Paris, by which they mean the New York school destroys the Paris School of Art, and the New York School becomes the new International of Art, the new cultural capital of the world. Now, when Bernard got back to Australia in 1951, he knew that these young artists in Sydney were really interested in Pollock, but he didn't worry too much because he knew the institutions weren't. Abstract expressionism was pretty well being ignored until about 1955 by the institutions. And then Pollock dies in 56. MoMA puts on an exhibition of Pollock's for the first time in 1956. We tend to think of Pollock being this really famous painter in the 40s, but he's not. It's not till the late 50s. And 58, MoMA realises that there's all these young artists really interested in the abstract expressionists, and they put together this exhibition called New American Painting, and they basically blitz Europe with it. It goes to 7 capital cities in Europe, and these are some shots from it. These are the cool abstract expressionists. This is Barnett Newman, de Kooning again, the hot. Now, the Europeans love Barnett Newman. They love the cool abstract expressionists, not so much the hot ones. And they do also this exhibition, a big exhibition of just Jackson Pollock, which sort of knocks the socks off. And so suddenly New York is where you have to go, not Paris. It takes Australians about 10 years to realise this. They keep going to London. But here the director of the British Council basically says what I just said. New York has begun to be seriously regarded as the future artistic capital of the Western Hemisphere. So that happens 58, 59. And so for the first time, Documenta, which is, it's only the second Documenta, but it's already regarded as the premier contemporary art exhibition in Europe. For the first time, the abstract expressionists get into Documenta, and they get into it in a big way, with a special room just for Pollock, which again puts New York on the map. And so here, this is the New York School. This is what everyone's looking at, right just as the 60s, start to explode, and you can decide for yourself which are the hot paintings and which are the cool paintings. And this is when Bernard starts to worry, because New York and New York US imperialism, he calls it US cultural imperialism, it's ruining everything. Now, the interesting thing that surprised me was there are these uncanny parallels between Nolan and Pollock in terms of their careers. In 1946, they both do their breakthrough painting. It's Ned Kelly for Nolan. It's pure abstract art. This is Pollock's first abstract painting, 1946, straight at the end of the war. They both have breakthrough exhibitions in 49 and 50. By breakthrough exhibitions, I mean exhibitions where the critics suddenly notice them and start saying, these are interesting, we should keep our eye on these artists. Then they have their cut-through exhibitions, 57 to 59, which is, I just talked about a couple of those. So, Pollock is in the Whitechapel Gallery, which is a major gallery in London for showing, cut-through exhibitions. In 57, Nolan in 58, and they're both in Documenta. Nolan's the first Australian artist to be shown in Documenta. Interestingly, not as an Australian artist, but as an English artist. So we have this interesting parallel. And in Nolan and Pollock, I think, are like twin figures that represent, one for America, one for Australia, what the new national art is. So it takes more than just the genius of Pollock and the New York School to sort of break through internationally. The world has to be ready for it. And the world is ready for it basically because of the Second World War and the collapse of Europe's empires. It means that these new world nations like Australia and the United States are no longer under the grip of Paris or of Europe, of the European centres. And both these countries at the same time sort of decide they want their own national art, not an art which is subservient to Europe and to the European tradition. And for Australia, that became Nolan. Nolan became our flag bearer. And for America, it became Pollock. And we think of Nolan painting these sort of quintessential Australian paintings, and that's exactly how the Americans thought of as Pollock. They thought of him as an American. But the interesting thing is about when you become a cultural centre, you become international at the same time, so that New York becomes part of the of our heritage as Australians, just as Paris used to be part of our heritage. So Pollock sort of seeps through for that. So Bernard, we then come to our first exhibition. Bernard in 1959, at the very time these exhibitions are going through Europe, says, I've got to do something about this. And the week before the New American Painting Show opens at the Tate, he gets a couple of artists together. They're young, they're in their 30s, that's sort of young for me, and gets them together and puts out this idea. I want to do this exhibition. We're going to stick it into Pollock and the abstract expressionists. It's going to be a painting all about maintaining the figurative in art against abstract art, because the abstract expressionists are all abstract, obviously. So the Antipodeans get launched. You can see the sort of things he says here. In the United States particularly, this is his opening speech at the exhibition, in the United States particularly, this compulsion to be abstract assumed quite terrifying proportions. I have not the slightest doubt that it testifies to a death of the human spirit. He's sort of a bit hysterical, really. It was left to an American of the Beat generation, Jackson Pollock, to realise its full possibilities. He's now the single most influential painter of the time. And Pollock, and that's definitely true, Pollock is the most influential painter of the post-war period, right through to the end of the 20th century. In the 60s, he is the most famous painter in the art world, more famous than Andy Warhol. So if you go through and just look at illustrations and art history books, there's more of Pollock there than any artist, in the 60s. And it's the same for Nolan in Australian books. Again, in his manifesto that he wrote with the exhibition, where he talks about this, wherever we look, New York, Paris, London, San Francisco, Sydney, he's in Melbourne, of course, this virus is coming. And so he has this exhibition. I won't say too much about it. The actual exhibition itself, these three paintings are in the exhibition. That's why they're up there. And more of this very famous series by Boyd, which is sort of made him famous. But artists and critics react very negatively to the exhibition because they say he's not understanding what's going on now. So we now go to the second exhibition. Now, what Bernard does, as soon as he gets this organised, he writes across to the Whitechapel Gallery, where there's just been a Jackson Pollock exhibition, and says, I want to do an Australian exhibition. Can I get in there? But the guy running it, Brian Robertson, doesn't answer his letters, refuses to answer his letters, refuses to talk to him. Whenever Bernard sends someone to go to meet him, he's not in his office because he's going to do it. Brian Robertson has decided he's going to do it. He's actually in cahoots with the director of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Hal Missingham, to put together a show. They're not going to let Bernard in because he's saying all these sort of stupid things as far as they're concerned. They want to have an exhibition that says, no, Australian art is up there with the Americans, just as good as the American abstract expressionists, this reactionary sort of Antipodeans thing. Antipodeans is Bernard's term for basically, he says the Antipodeans are Pollock, Boyd, Tucker, that generation, and then the second generation who come after him. Only Boyd was in that because the others refused to be in it. Nolan and Tucker said, no, we're not going to be part of your sort of ideological thing. So these are the sort of paintings that were in recent Australian paintings. Bernard's was about 60 or 70 paintings with only 7 artists, whereas this is 111 paintings with 55 artists. All of Bernard's were only in their 30s. These artists are all across different generations. It's a sort of full-on show of Australian art. Not all the work is abstract. Here's the painting by Boyd. All of the artists that Bernard had in the Antipodeans are in this exhibition as well. So it's a fairly accurate exhibition, I guess, of what was happening at the time. Now, Brian Robinson thought Pollock was an amazing painter, and he thought Sidney Nolan was an amazing painter. He believed their art, even though one's figurative and one abstract, speaking about these post-war existential sort of times that we're living in. Robert Hughes, who I'm sure you all know, he's only in his mid-20s, who has 2 paintings in this exhibition, writes the introduction. And he talks about, does it reflect an Indigenous... An Indigenous temperament, he doesn't mean an Aboriginal temperament. He means a white Australian temperament. He's asking, is there going to be an Australian school of art? We've had a Paris School of Art, we've had a New York School of Art. Well, this is it, he's sort of saying, basically. He doesn't say yes, but he's really saying this is the Australian School of Art, just like the New York School of Art. This is a real Australian national art that we've finally got. None of the Impressionists or anything like this. This is sort of a modern Australian thing. And so Bernard, of course, never forgives Brian Robinson for the rest of his life. He has a go at him whenever he can. So you have this interesting debate now occurring between these 2 camps going on. Now, what Bernard's main thing of getting at Robinson is he said he's very strong on primitivism. And Bernard hated primitivism in modern art. He associated it with fascism. And at the time that Brian Robinson is putting together the Australian show, he's writing one of the first books on Jackson Pollock, like a big book on Jackson Pollock. That was one of the things I had. Both of them have a big monograph, thick monograph, published on them in 1960 and 61. Brian Robinson is writing the one on Pollock when he's in Australia choosing the work. And Bernard has a go at how he writes about Pollock in that book. Pollock is presented as a sort of Greenwich Village Tarzan. It's true, that's how Brian Robinson talks about him. For the high purple prose of Robert's primitivism. And so then he says at the Whitechapel, the English public were invited to enjoy 2 kinds of noble savagery. One from America, which was the Pollock show. One from Australia, which was the Sidney Nolan show he put on, and this show. We were packaged as exotica and became high fashion for a London season and then discarded. And all that is sort of true. It's actually sort of what happened. That's how Robertson wrote about Australians, the same way he wrote about Pollock, because he thought Europe had sort of gone corrupt and they needed toughening up and back to the jungle. Whereas Bernard said our art is actually critiquing European modernism, and it needs to be about this critique of European modernism, not primitivism. Now, primitivism was very big in contemporary art in the 50s and 60s. Tony Tuxon, whom probably most of you know about, who's a deputy director of the Art Gallery in New South Wales, and I said Hal Missingham is the silent partner in that. So when he comes out, Tony Tuxon becomes his principal assistant. Tony Tuxon is working with Brian Robinson, helping him put together this exhibition. Robertson comes out when Tony Tuxon is organising this very famous book exhibition, Australian Aboriginal Art, which travels around all the state galleries shortly after Robertson leaves. And so Robertson, and he references it a little bit in his essays, he's very interested in Aboriginal art. Back in London, at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art, which is really the London avant-garde hangout, they have this exhibition that has Aboriginal art in, and this is all Aboriginal art. There's a huge interest in Aboriginal art at the time. And of course, there's Tony Tuxon as a painter. Interested in Aboriginal art and Jackson Pollock. And first discovers Aboriginal art, at the same time he discovers Pollock around 1949, 1950. Alan McCulloch, art critic in Melbourne, thinks this exhibition is just amazing and that we should send it to the Venice Biennale. Tries hard to get it sent to the Venice Biennale, tries hard to get bits of it included in the big exhibition of Australian art that the Tate is putting together, but is knocked back by the Australian government authorities saying it's not appropriate for the image of Australia, to have Aboriginal art there. So this is what I mean, something's bubbling away. Now what's bubbling away is that there are artists like Tuxon and a lot of other artists who are, well, should we say influenced by Aboriginal art or engaging with Aboriginal art in their artwork. But there are also Aboriginal artists who are engaging with Western ideas of art and what art's about. So we have an artwork like this. It's about Easter. It's painted on a ping pong table, but the whole composition is a composition that, and the way it's put in the frame and everything, reflects Western ideas of composition. And we see, Marlowin's, these drawings here, they don't even particularly look like Aboriginal art at first, unless I guess you know a lot about Aboriginal art. Marlowin is the one who does this painting that gets in the that's chosen in the 1945, flying over Sydney, or Sydney from the air. And these two paintings, going in the church and speaking to Christian ideas of cosmology. It's sort of a new type of cosmology. Terry Smith, who's a student of Bernard Smith, coined this word bridge work to refer to this sort of artwork that goes on where different cultures start speaking to each other and developing parallel sort of ways of working. They don't necessarily meet, that retain their own sensibilities, but nevertheless they're like parallel lines. And a little quote from Terry there. And so this is going on in the 60s, both in in European Australian art and Aboriginal Australian art. However, that's from the artists. However, the art historians don't pick up on it, and nor really do the anthropologists. So we have these two books published within 2 years of each other. They're both histories of Australian art. Tuxon has an essay in there, but Bernard, the anthropologist, edits it, one by Bernard, one by them. Two parallel histories that aren't really aware of each other. Tuxon writes about that in Australia in this essay, but Tuxon himself, when he curates this work, it stays within a primitivist zone. There's no sort of bridge work. We don't get that and really until now with this sort of curation. going on the Arco in New South Wales, where you get this, what Terry meant by this bridge work. Whereas you feel that, say, an artist like Fairweather, who's clearly influenced by Indigenous art, is actually interested in that idea. Running out of time. So this is the third exhibition. Because Robertson's exhibition, Recent Australian Painting, is so successful in London, the Australian institutions say, oh gee, the English love this art, it must be good. So the NGV, the next year, 1962, puts on this exhibition, Rebels and Precursors, Aspects of Painting at Melbourne. And these are the artists in it. There's about 6 artists, they're all Melbourne artists. This is what the gallery would have looked like beforehand. This was the narrative beforehand. And Hal Missingham wrote this in 1957, that what he called the Gumtree School sustained the bulk of local painting and was regarded by the Australian public as the true Australian vision. The only artist to get in recent Australian painting was William Dobell. Dobell and Margaret Preston, who was both considered modernists, had sort of become part of this story in the 40s and 50s, whereas this sort of goes back further. So this now becomes Australian art. And this narrative is very quickly becomes something from the past, a sort of prehistory of Australian art. And this narrative really takes hold in the 60s with Nolan as the leading figure. So here's a little graph, 3 histories of Australian art of where they pay most attention. You get a little blip with the Impressionists and you get a much bigger blip with let's call them the Antipodeans. And then it goes back down again. So this is the canon, the new canon. And this canon is still there. An Impressionist, Tom Roberts, has more pictures in the Australian history books, art history books than any others. But then Nolan's not far behind, and then Drysdale and Boyd are not far behind him. So this little, you get this little patch of Robertson Street and Drysdale, Nolan and Boyd. And I just stick that Nolan painting, probably don't think of Nolan doing paintings like that. 1987, just before 1988, about deaths in custody. I think I'll just skip through this because I've run out of time. But this is what Nolan was doing in the 60s in England. Works like this, works that are very much about the war, about Auschwitz, an atom bomb exploding in the central desert of Australia, which it actually was. He was a keen campaigner against atom bomb. I was going to talk about this really famous painting, but I won't, because I just want to go quickly. And I wanted to show those Nolans because this is what Australian art is, but this is what New York art is happening. And you can see that, let's just call it the Antipodean aesthetic, is a very hot aesthetic. And this is a very cool aesthetic, even though it's Atom Bombs by Warhol, Disaster series, a lot of violence in here. You feel the shadow of the war still there, playing out in the 60s in New York, but in this very sort of ironic, detached, cool way. And this is chapter 2, which is very quick, the cool current of US cultural imperialism. Now, whereas the sort of hot current of abstract expressionism the Australians got onto in recent Australian painting, the cool current also came through exactly the same way to Australia, which is via London. So in 1960, you don't just have recent Australian painting going up. You've got these Australian artists there, younger, even they're only in their 20s, in London, being turned on by these exhibitions of Barnett Newman and other, like Morris Lewis, I think it's an exhibition at Whitechapel as well. And at the same time, the English artists have been turned on by them too. And so you get these artists, and there's a mix of English, American and Australian artists there. You can figure out which ones are which. But the art all starts looking the same. We no longer have a national art, we have an international art. And this term international becomes, in Australia, a key thing. You know, as Australian artists, we're interested in international art. We're not interested in what is Australian art. It becomes an irrelevant question. So Tony McGillick and Dick Watkins are the two Australians in London. Ian Byrne, we've mentioned, is also in London in the mid-60s and then goes to New York. Tony McGillick comes back in the mid-60s and founds Central Street Galleries in London, in Sydney, which says, you know, this is what we should be doing, and gets a lot of artists behind him. And then in 1967, about 10 years after Europe, we finally get our American painting show. Comes through Melbourne and Sydney in 1967, a watershed event, etc., dragged into the 20th century finally. 67 is an interesting year, isn't it? It's when the referendum happens. And it's after 67 that a whole new idea of Australian art starts up. If this was going into the 70s, we'd be suddenly in a couple of years with Papunya and Aboriginal painting. But it's this that is turning everyone's eyes. No one's thinking, oh, we've had the referendum and Papunya's coming in a few years' time, I better start going there. I've got to go there. And so the next year we have the Field in Melbourne. The NGV's just got a whole new building. They decide that they're not going to do an exhibition on Streeton or Nolan. They're going to do the very latest thing that just came through last year from New York. And they go to Central Street Galleries and a few other young artists and pull together Nigel Lendon's in. I should have it at Nigel Lendon here. Bugger. You know, Nigel was in this exhibition, and they do this exhibition at the NGV basically to say, aren't we up to date? Aren't we cool? And as soon as that exhibition happens, that's the institution accepting it. Basically, Nolan is old hat, you know, overnight, basically. And I know I have to end. That's my slide. That's what happens next year. We're suddenly somewhere, you know, totally new. We're almost into the 70s, and that really interesting story. Well, I think it's a really interesting story about Pollock and Australian art is sort of gone in a way. Well. So that's it, that's the last slide.